June of 1938. Garfield County, Oklahoma. Edgar Pruitt stretched the first rope across the south field before sunrise, driving the anchor stakes with a maul while the air was still cool enough to work without stopping. He was 44 years old, had farmed 280 acres in Garfield County since 1919, winter wheat and grain sorghum on the upland fields, a small vegetable patch behind the house, a 5-acre alfalfa field on the low ground near Boggy Creek that required irrigation to make a second cutting in July. The Boggy Creek low ground was where he was working now, and the rope he was stretching across it was not what anyone in Garfield County called irrigation equipment. It was binder twine. 3-ply sisal binder twine, the same twine that ran through every grain binder in Oklahoma, sold in 14-pound balls at every farm supply store in the county for $65 a ball. He'd bought 8 balls in May, 112 pounds of twine, spending $5.20. He drove the last anchor stake and walked back to the creek bank. The system he'd designed over the winter was built on a principle he'd read about in a 1932 issue of Farm Journal that he'd saved and reread enough times that the pages had developed creases along their fold lines from storage. The article described capillary irrigation, the movement of water through fibrous material by capillary action, the same mechanism by which water moved through soil and through plant tissue. A rope or cord partially submerged in water would wick moisture laterally along its length and release it to the soil surface through its lower face if the rope was in contact with the ground. The article had described the method as experimental. It had been reported from a trial at a state agricultural station in Arizona and had shown mixed results depending on soil type and rope material. Edgar had been thinking about it for 6 years. The problem was water. Boggy Creek ran reliably in spring and early summer, but by July, in a dry year, it ran thin. Enough for the alfalfa's first 2 cuttings, but not enough for the third. Without a third cutting, the alfalfa field's per-acre return dropped by a third. In wet years, it didn't matter. In the dry years that had been accumulating since 1930, it mattered considerably. Pumped irrigation was the standard answer. A centrifugal pump on the creek bank, an engine to drive it, aluminum pipe to distribute the water. His neighbor to the west, a man named Carl Dietrich, had installed a pump and pipe system in 1935 for the alfalfa ground he kept on the same drainage. The pump and pipe had cost Carl $380. Edgar had 520 tons worth of binder twine and an idea that the county extension agent in Enid, a man named Horace Latimer, had already told him wouldn't work at agricultural scale. Latimer had visited in May when word of the twine purchase had made its way around the elevator. He'd stood at the creek bank and looked at the 8 balls of sisal twine stacked on the tailgate and told Edgar that capillary wicking in rope material was a laboratory observation that had not been successfully applied at field scale in any documented trial. He said the wicking rate through sisal was too slow to deliver meaningful moisture to a crop. He said the alfalfa would need 2 inches of water per week in July to maintain growth. He said a rope couldn't deliver 2 inches per week. He left without charging for the consultation, which Edgar took as a sign of how little faith Latimer had in billing him. Carl Dietrich heard about the twine from someone at the grain elevator. He drove past the south field in early June and saw Edgar driving the anchor stakes. He pulled over and looked from the road for a while. He drove on. The layout was this. Edgar had cleared a shallow channel from the creek bank across the 5 alfalfa acres, a trench 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, running with the natural contour of the ground at a grade of 2 inches per 100 feet. Enough slope to move water by gravity, but shallow enough that the channel wouldn't run fast. This was not part of the rope system. This was the delivery channel, the one piece of infrastructure he'd taken from standard gravity irrigation practice. From the channel, the ropes extended perpendicular across the field. running uphill at right angles to the channel. Across the alfalfa rows, each rope laid directly on the soil's surface, with one end hanging into the channel and the other end staked at the far field boundary. Each rope was 80 feet long. He'd cut the twine from the 14-pound balls into 80-foot sections and laid them at 30-inch intervals across the field width. The principle? Water in the channel would wick along the ropes by capillary action, delivering moisture to the soil surface along the rope's entire length. The soil surface contact would allow the moisture to move downward into the root zone by gravity and by the soil's own capillary draw. Each rope served a 30-inch wide strip of alfalfa. The calculation he'd done in the winter, working from the Farm Journal article's data on sisal wicking rates, suggested that a sisal rope in contact with a standing water source would move approximately 0.4 gallons per hour per linear foot of rope under typical summer conditions. 80 feet of rope at 0.4 gallons per foot per hour. 32 gallons per hour. 32 ropes across the 5 acres, 1,024 gallons per hour. An inch of water on 5 acres required 135,000 gallons. At 1,024 gallons per hour, 132 hours of wicking to deliver 1 inch. He looked at that number in January and wrote it down carefully and looked at it again. 1 inch in 132 hours was not 2 inches per week. It was approximately half of Latimer's 2-inch requirement. He wrote that down too. Then he wrote, what if the calculation was wrong? The calculation was wrong. Not in the way Latimer had been right. The wicking rate per linear foot wasn't the limiting factor. The limiting factor was the contact surface area between the rope and the soil. The Farm Journal article had described ropes laid on a hard surface, where the contact face was narrow. Alfalfa ground in June was worked ground, cultivated, slightly rough, with a surface texture that increased the contact face of each rope from a narrow tangent to a broader engagement as the rope settled into the irregular surface overnight. He went to the field at 6 a.m. on the 3rd morning of the first test run, before the sun had dried the surface. He laid a steel tape across a 10-foot section of the first rope. He counted the dark moisture patches where the rope had delivered water to the soil's surface. Continuous along the rope's underside, not spotty. Continuous. He dug a small hole at the rope midpoint with his pocket knife. The moisture was at 3 inches depth. He dug at the far end of an 80-foot rope. Moisture at 2 inches depth at 80 feet from the channel. He went home and sat at the kitchen table. The wicking was reaching the full length of the rope. The rate was not the 0.4 gallons per foot his calculation had assumed. He couldn't measure it precisely with what he had available. But the soil moisture was present at 80 feet, which meant the system was delivering water to the full field width. He let it run for 72 hours and checked the alfalfa. The alfalfa showed no stress. The adjacent upland alfalfa, same field, not under the rope coverage, was showing the beginning of wilt, the leaves curling slightly at their edges in the afternoon heat. He walked the boundary between the roped section and the unroped section 3 times. The line was visible. He expanded the system to 12 acres in July of 1938. 5 original acres, plus 7 additional acres of grain sorghum on the adjacent slope. The sorghum required less water than alfalfa, but was in its critical pollination period in July and was showing stress without the rope coverage. He bought 4 more balls of twine at $0.65 then each, $2.60. He laid the expansion ropes over 2 days. Total system cost at the end of July 1938, $7.80 in twine. The anchor stakes were salvaged fence posts. The delivery channel had been dug by hand over 3 evenings in May. The labor was his own. Carl Dietrich stopped at the field road in mid-July. The alfalfa under the rope coverage was dark green and standing. The upland alfalfa outside the coverage was showing stress. The line between them was, as Edgar had noted, visible. Dietrich stood at the road for a while. He said it wasn't what he'd expected. Edgar said he'd gathered that. Dietrich said he'd spent $380 on the pump system. Edgar said he knew. Dietrich drove on. He came back the following week and asked Edgar how the ropes were laid. Edgar showed him. Latimer drove out from Enid in August. He'd heard the results from the elevator and from 2 other farmers who had driven past the field and stopped. He walked the rope installation with Edgar for an hour, asking questions about the wicking rate and the soil moisture depth at different rope lengths. He dug several test holes himself with a sampling tube he carried in his truck. He found consistent soil moisture to 4-inch depth at the 40-foot rope position and 2.5-inch depth at the 80-foot rope position. The alfalfa root zone in the first 12 inches of soil was measurably wetter under the ropes than in the unroped sections, even accounting for different sun exposure. He said the system was working. He said he was surprised it was working. He said the surprise was his own error. Edgar said he appreciated that. Latimer asked if Edgar intended to expand the system. Edgar said he was thinking about 30 more acres of winter wheat ground along the Boggy Creek drainage for the following season. He said capillary irrigation during the grain fill period in June was something he wanted to see. Latimer said he'd like to come back and look at it if Edgar ran the trial. Edgar said he'd be welcome. The 1939 expansion covered the wheat ground, as Latimer had said. 30 additional acres on the Boggy Creek slope. 320 ropes at 80 feet each, running from 2 parallel delivery channels laid at grade along the contour. Edgar bought 14 balls of twine for the expansion. $9,000. The winter wheat of 1939 came through grain fill in June, with the wheat on the rope section averaging 28 bushels per acre. The unroped sections of the same field, same variety, same seed date, averaged 19 bushels per acre. 9 bushels per acre difference. On 30 acres at the current wheat price of $0.69 per bushel, $186.30 in additional revenue from the roped section. The rope for 30 acres had cost $9.10. Latimer included the 1939 results in his Garfield County Extension Report filed with the Oklahoma A&M College of Agriculture in Stillwater. 3 paragraphs in the annual report, under the heading Experimental Irrigation Methods. He described the rope capillary system, the installation cost, and the yield comparison. He gave Edgar's name and county. The Oklahoma A&M Extension Office forwarded the report to a researcher in the agronomy department who was studying low-cost irrigation methods for dryland wheat farms in the Southern Plains. The researcher wrote to Edgar in September of 1939 and asked for permission to study the system more formally. Edgar wrote back and said he was welcome to come look. The researcher, a man named Willis Garner, drove from Stillwater to Garfield County in October of 1939. He spent 2 days at the farm with a set of tensiometers, soil moisture measuring devices, and a length of rope he tested for wicking rate in a calibrated lab container he'd brought in his truck. He measured the wicking rate of 3-ply sisal twine at 0.62 gallons per linear foot per hour when the rope was laid on cultivated silt loam soil, significantly higher than the 0.4 gallons that Edgar's winter calculation had assumed, and nearly 60% higher than the Farm Journal article's data. The increase came from the soil contact surface area, which the article's laboratory measurement on a hard surface had severely understated. Garner said the underestimate in Edgar's original calculation was what had made the system work. Edgar said he wasn't sure he followed that. Garner said if Edgar had calculated the actual wicking rate in field conditions before building the system, he would have seen that the system could deliver adequate moisture and the analysis would have supported proceeding. But the calculation Edgar had done showed the system was marginal, barely half the required delivery rate, and he had built it anyway. If the calculation had been correct, the decision would have been easy. Because the calculation was wrong in the pessimistic direction, the decision had required proceeding against uncertainty. He said most experiments required that. Edgar said he'd thought about it differently. He said he'd thought the calculation might be wrong, which was different from knowing it was wrong. Garner said that was a useful distinction. He published a paper in the Oklahoma Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin in 1941. 11 pages. He described the Garfield County rope capillary system in full technical detail, including the tensiometer measurements, the wicking rate data, and the yield comparisons from 1938 and 1939. He recommended the system for small operators on sandy and silt loam soils in the southern plains as an economical alternative to pumped irrigation for critical period moisture delivery. He named Edgar in the acknowledgments. Edgar ran the rope system on the Boggy Creek drainage through the dry summers of 1939, 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, and 1945, 7 seasons. The system covered 150 acres by 1941, extended across the full Boggy Creek bottom and the adjacent wheat ground in a network of delivery channels and rope sets that he added to incrementally each year with new twine as the old deteriorated. Sisal twine in soil contact lasted approximately 2 seasons before the fibers began to break down from moisture and microbial activity. He replaced the rope set every other year, buying new twine in late April before the season, pulling the old twine and composting it with the crop residue, laying the new twine in the same positions. Annual twine cost for 150 acres, $22 to $28, depending on the price that year. Carl Dietrich's pump system, maintained over the same period, required a new pump head in 1941, $64. A replacement engine gasket set in 1943, 18, and 40 feet of new aluminum pipe when a section was damaged by a disc harrow in 1944, 31. Fuel for the engine, approximately $35 per season. Dietrich's annual operating cost, $35 in fuel plus amortized maintenance. Edgar's annual operating cost, $22 to $28 in twine, on 30 times more acres. Dietrich didn't calculate this directly. Garner did, in a follow-up bulletin he wrote in 1944, comparing the two systems side by side, having visited both operations in Garfield County. He published the comparison without naming Dietrich. He named the pump system as Type A conventional installation. He named the rope system as the Pruitt method. Edgar Pruitt died in 1952. He'd farmed the Boggy Creek ground through 1949 when his son Marvin took the operation. Marvin ran the rope system through 2 more dry seasons, 1952 and 1953, before center pivot irrigation became available to small operators at a lease price that made the economics different. He pulled the rope system out in the spring of 1954 and composted the last of the twine with the wheat stubble. He kept a ball of sisal twine on the shed shelf for the rest of his working life, not connected to anything, just on the shelf. He'd asked his father once why the shelf held a ball of twine that wasn't attached to any binder. Edgar had said it was attached to something. Marvin had been young enough that the answer had satisfied him at the time. He understood it later. The delivery channels Edgar had cut along the Boggy Creek contour in 1938 and 1939 are still visible from the air in dry years, when the crop shows differential stress along their alignments. The channels are shallow, 6 inches deep, grown in with grass, but they run true to the contour. The grade Edgar calculated by hand with a carpenter's level and a 10-foot board and 44 years of knowing where his water went. They show up in the crop and nowhere else. He left the lines in the ground. That was enough.